omnipotent either. I think God is in the process of is becoming. God is not only just becoming, but is becoming.
Acknowledging that what we're doing is describing our perceptions and attempting to navigate the world around us, rather than attempting to describe some objective feature of reality that's mind independent. So process philosophy.
And there's no red Porsche inside the supercomputer. So that's sort of the idea, is that space-time is just a headset.
That has to be governed by mathematical structure. You know, the perceiver would have nothing to name, would have no structure whatsoever without the structure, but the structure would have no meaning, would have no name without the perceiver, the namer. So it's this.
So one of the centerpieces of the argument that you make in this book, Recapture the Rapture, is derived from Nietzsche's famous observation about the death of God. So I thought maybe we could start by talking about that. It seems to me that if you wanted to secularize that discussion, you'd do it in something approximating the following manner. You'd assume that there's only two possibilities, and one possibility would be that our perceptions and our thoughts and our goal-directed striving moves towards something approximating a higher order or transcendental unity, or it doesn't. Those are the only two options as far as I can.
That seems like a fairly good dichotomy. It either is or it isn't. Now here we do run into the interesting human feature. We are modelers. We try to model everything. You could say, you know, at some base level, there's a bunch of things that are influencing our survival. A lot of people would say, you know, that's information or mathematics, natural law, whatever. But at some layer, as it filters up into our perception, we begin to model it. So we, you know, from the languages we use, the words that are these kind of packaged, you know, networks of information, of shared experiences and associations and information that we kind of cast to one another. And we hope that the other person, the receiver, has had similar enough experiences to overlap, you know, and experience the emotions we want and the motivations we want and perform whatever action and engage with us. So language and words to colors, the colors we see, the things we hold in our hands to use, and then on up to abstract things like love or the concept of speciation or international borders. You know, these things are models. So we like to discuss things. We like to look at the world around us and attribute thingness. This is a pencil. This is two pencils. They are both the same thing in some sense, right? But they're also different things. So if I murder someone with this pencil and not with this one, and then Savannah, my sister, has this one, then it becomes, and they think she did it because she has a pencil, it becomes extremely important, the difference between these pencils. But it's also extremely important, the sameness, for a bunch of other reasons. So we like to attribute thingness, and Peterson here is proposing that all things tend either towards one unifying, what did he call it?
Unity, towards something approximating a higher order or transcendental unity.
A higher order transcendental unity. So supposedly that would be some, I mean, they'll probably get into it, but some pattern. I mean, a pattern already describes a relation of things, a relation of, you know, lesser probably things, definitionally speaking. So is it a pattern? Is it one thing? It's kind of hard, impossible for us to imagine what one thing alone in isolation even could mean. It seems like an incomprehensible idea. So it's probably a pattern of some sort, or it doesn't. So we're already deciding, you know, things either tend towards one thing or they don't. Now this puts kind of some static thing at the top, or multiple static things at the top, multiple branching things that divide us. But the other alternative, there's this thing called process philosophy, this category of ways of thinking called process philosophy that focuses much more on processes. And this is something, you know, obviously, which has some overlap with, say, Eastern ideas. This is something which arose in tandem with a lot of the more modern stuff that focuses on probably more perception, focuses on acknowledging that what we're doing is describing our perceptions and attempting to navigate the world around us, given how it arises and appears to us, rather than attempting to describe some objective feature of reality that's mind independent. So process philosophy. Process philosophy is based on the premise that being is dynamic, and that the dynamic nature of being should be the primary focus of any comprehensive philosophical account of reality and our place within it. So as soon as you kind of posit a, say, logical or purely abstract theory, then you need to posit how it actually manifests in reality. And in order to do that, you need to acknowledge the acting out of these different parts in reality. Even though we experience our world and ourselves as continuously changing, Western metaphysics has long been obsessed with describing reality as an assembly of static individuals whose dynamic features are either taken to be mere appearances or ontologically secondary and derivative. For process philosophers, the adventure of philosophy begins with a set of problems that traditional metaphysics marginalizes or even sidesteps altogether. What is dynamicity or becoming? If it is the way we experience reality, how should we interpret this metaphysically? Are there several varieties of becoming? For instance, the uniform going on of activities versus the coming about of developments? Do all developments have the same way of occurring, quite independently of what is coming about? Okay. Anyway, I don't want to go too deep, but you get the point. Ian McGilchrist talks about this. So God as being, being in the English sense has a little bit more of a static feel because it's a word we use quite often. Being itself, nature itself. But if you actually think about it, what it means, being, I heard an Italian philosopher give a speech once about how it's a kind of unique word in English. They don't have it. They have to be, essere, ser, in all the Latin languages. I don't know what it is in French, but I speak all the other Latin languages. So being. So it's and then Ian McGilchrist say, or someone comes along and they recognize that we've gotten too familiar with that word. So they say becoming or, process.
It looks like to me.
And it's a fool who says anything positive about the nature of God, but I'm not convinced that God is omniscient and omnipotent either. I think God is in the process of is becoming. God is not only just becoming, but is becoming, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, so being and becoming.
More becoming. I think
More
that becoming is the important thing.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think that? I mean, it's
Why do I
also
think
a
that?
strange segue. I mean, I'm not criticizing, but I'm curious. What drove you to that conclusion?
An awful lot of things, really. I think that everything is a process. In fact, I'm writing a book called There Are No Things.
Oh, what are there instead?
There are processes.
Yes.
And there are patterns.
Patterns.
Yes.
That's why I think music is so powerful.
Music is one of the most mysterious and wonderful things in the universe.
But the idea is maybe things don't tend towards anything. Like this is just a pencil. If I flake off a little piece of it, that's just a little chip of wood. What do you mean that's tending towards something? What do you mean to imply that's part of some overall pattern? No, we put the pattern onto that because of perceptions, just like we interpret things through space-time. Without humans, without any conscious beings to observe, there's no space-time in the universe, is there? I mean, there are particles in motion interacting according to natural law, but space-time seems like this thing that emerges because of perception.
There's a supercomputer that's taking the inputs from like your headset. What direction are you looking with your headset? Maybe you've got a bodysuit, so it's looking at your arm movements and so forth, and it's feeding all that into a supercomputer where it's got a model of the game, and in that model there's some red Porsche model. Of course, there's no red Porsche in the computer. And it knows then how to coordinate and send the photons to your headset in Canada and my headset in Irvine and someone else's headset in China, so that we have this notion of a persistent reality of a Porsche, even though individually, for each one of us, local realism is false. The Porsche doesn't even exist until I render it. And there's no red Porsche inside the supercomputer. So that's sort of the idea, is that space-time is just a headset. And there's behind space-time, there's going to be an incredibly complicated realm to explore.
When I was in my traveling backpacking days, you'd meet all these hippies talking about how time is just an illusion, and it was so annoying, and it still is, because they use it to pretend like we can connect all our minds or commune with the stars or to justify doing mushrooms every second hour. But well, maybe I need to be more open to that. Who knows? But the idea is, without conscious beings to attribute, this is red, this is green, this happened yesterday, this is happening tomorrow. There's no awareness, there's just things bumping into each other. So in some fundamental way, I guess, Peterson's and the pragmatists and the existentialists and the process philosophers' view is that what is perceived and experienced is so fundamental, perhaps it's base reality in some idealistic sense, but it's certainly so fundamental that it structures and gives life to everything atop that, which are the only things we can discuss. So perception is kind of at the base there. And this is why we try to attribute thingness to the world so we can interact with it.
You'd assume that there's only two possibilities. And one possibility would be that our perceptions and our thoughts and our goal-directed striving moves towards something approximating a higher order or transcendental unity, or it doesn't. Those are the only two options as far as I can.
So the other option could be that there is no unifying anything of any sort, no branching anything and no unifying anything, but every single thing is just precisely as it is. This tiny little particle here is just as it is, totally unaware, totally meaningless, outside of my mind. And then I come along and ascribe similarity to all the other pieces of the pencil and to all the other things that gave rise to it in civilization. And this is, an illusion in the sense that none of reality outside of us tends towards some overarching thing, but we desire it to, so we describe it as if it does, and we create this idea of a religion. And that leads us and guides us, but it only exists in our heads. So the ongoing living process of this religious conversation is kind of the essence of meaning to us. This would be I guess what I'm describing is, in the conscious mind, things are always ongoing, processing, living. It doesn't tend towards anything outside of us. It's just this ongoing dialogue between our awareness and the environment we're in. So it's a process, a conversation, never resolving. But then you get, then you get to this fundamental question of, okay, so how do we fit perception into our worldview? When we're describing how reality is, we can't restrict ourselves only to mathematical or rationalist language. This is probably Peterson's critique of the rationalists. You cannot describe reality without acknowledging the meaning space. You cannot describe reality only as a bunch of particles bumping into one another. As soon as you decide to do anything, you're admitting an ethos. As soon as you decide to describe anything, actually, you're already admitting that you have this evolved structure which causes these specific things to arise in your perception. So this microphone, or this concept of a debate or a worldview. And so as soon as you even use words, you're acknowledging the ethos that underpins you. And, then Peterson tries to connect that ethos to something, as he's saying, uniting and grand. The skeptic probably just observes, well, we're conscious, we don't know where that comes from. I mean, this gets to the free will debate. Presuming that we would function exactly the same without consciousness, you could just say we're like a little machine or robot with this perceptual apparatus. So it takes in information in these specific forms because that allowed it to react quicker in its environment. That's, the way we can navigate a world with gravity and predators and lights and stuff, is we transform the information into this, eye, cornea, retina that interprets light as color, and that lets us do certain things that a computer would never have been able to do, or a computer could certainly never have evolved to do. So it's still perhaps a very fundamental mystery how perception comes about, or how consciousness comes about rather. But presuming that it plays no role, that we're just machines and everything is mechanistic. What was I saying? Peterson's challenge is, how do you explain perception, I guess, and he says that telling stories about it is the most motivating, compelling way we've found, and that has to be accepted as true in some way. The skeptic probably just says, well, it causes all this harm. We don't know how it came about, but certainly we can point to religion and say here, it's irrational or dogmatic. So no, let's try to model things as we can, which is science and rationality, and then let's, acknowledge that there's meaningful ways to use science and rationality to us, these conscious beings.
It's two things. Right. There's philosophical naturalism and there's methodological naturalism. Mm-hmm. And philosophical naturalism is this assertion that nothing but the natural exists. That's not, in my opinion, a defensible position at all, because it is an assertion that nothing but the natural exists, and I don't know how you came up with that. But there's methodological naturalism, which is basically the foundation of science, which is we can only investigate those things within nature. We have no mechanism for investigating things that aren't natural. And so we are going to confine our methodology to the realm of methodological naturalism. And it's not a pronouncement that the supernatural doesn't exist. It's an acknowledgement that because we cannot test for or confirm the supernatural, we're not going to make pronouncements that it is true or isn't true. We're just going to keep operating within this framework. And the curious thing is that for everything that we've found an explanation for, the answer has been natural.
Yeah.
Now,
so there's this recognition of nature as dialogical, kind of between structure and the perceiver. The perceiver is naming things and, that's nested in, say, a deterministic structure entirely, perhaps, but the perceiver is naming them and perceiving them as the thing it names, and that has to be governed by mathematical structure. The perceiver would have nothing to name, would have no structure whatsoever without the structure, but the structure would have no meaning, would have no name without the perceiver, the namer. So it's this thing that's interplaying, and this, through eons and eons and eons has produced us in this particular place.
The idea of a monotheistic God at the bottom of everything or at the top is an elaboration of the idea that all the things that human beings are oriented towards come together in a unity. And the problem with questioning that hypothesis is that you fall into the problem that there's no organizing principle at all. That's the problem of nihilism. Or alternatively, you fall into the problem that if there's nothing that unites our striving at the highest level, then we have to live in psychological and social conflict, because the various things that drive us will be antagonistic to one another.
I would say that's a good description, yeah. Now, of course, a lot of Westerners seem to land here and be content with it. I mean, a lot of Easterners too. The idea of life as process. There seems to be more angst, say, in Westerners, more focus on angst or tension. Kierkegaard talks about despair, anxiety, how you're constantly reaching for something and we're constantly having to move forward into a changing future. But as soon as we meet something unfamiliar, we're either not prepared for it and we die, or we have to integrate new changes. So, this is being, this is becoming, this is the process, the conversation between the individual that you are and the stuff out there that you need to deal with. And then, you pass on your code to your children and they deal with a new environment. So it's this ongoing, this is an evolutionary argument that probably most skeptics, also rationalists, would fully embrace. And it kind of rejects the idea of anything as static and says, okay, to continue growing in any way, to continue experiencing in any way, we actually need to be continually crossing these boundaries. You have the boundary of, your species, your community, but then ultimately you as an individual. If you're all-encompassing, you're having no experience whatsoever. So you need to cross the borders to interact with things that are different than you in order to experience and grow. And identity itself is in some way this fluid conversation. So a lot of people would say that, that's probably some fundamental cornerstone of what reality itself is. It's not a static, overarching, uniting thing. It's not nothingness or no uniting thing whatsoever. It's this playing out of logic, say, or natural law as we are aware of it, or as, connects to us, impacts our experience, and we're either prepared for it and change or not.
Will be antagonistic to one another.
So, does it have to be described in negative terms, antagonistic, anxious, suffering? We regularly recognize these things as very fundamental to being and very fundamental to meaning. Certainly, I think they would be fundamental to Peterson's philosophy himself. So, is that an unsatisfactory answer? The idea of tension or conversation or, ongoing process without some ultimate end?
So you fall into the problem of nihilism or a disunified plurality. Another problem emerges too, and both Nietzsche and Dostoevsky pointed to this because they were thinking along parallel tracks, which is that if the hypothesis that has served as the highest unity disappears, and a unity is psychologically and socially necessary, then other forms of unity will emerge to replace the dead value. And so I would say...
Yeah, so that seems pretty defensible as well. Supposing religion evolved, very early and is a very fundamental part of the way we perceive and navigate, you could posit that new technologies introduce pieces and parts of that the desire for secularism and freedom, and, contraception, woohoo, and endless entertainment and, equal rights. So we no longer accept these parts of the sacred text that were clearly tyrannical. You could say development in science on one dimension has provided certain pieces to replace it, but perhaps religion is so fundamental that it still leaves a hunger in other ways that can't be quite satisfied or met with science. Those would be the ways I was talking about earlier with ritual, embodiment, this full integration of the body's chemistry with whatever we're acting out, probably something to do with stepping out of a abstract intellectual role and into or out of an abstract intellectual space and into a role that you kind of embody and forget about your individuality and are just part of the collective ritual in that moment, maybe.
And this also follows Nietzsche and Dostoevsky's thought that one of the things that we've seen happening in consequence of the death of God, apart from nihilism and plurality, is the insistence that power, for example, unifies. That's a Marxist insistence or a postmodern insistence that the only unifying narrative is one of power. And so the unity problem looks to me like it's inescapable, whether you approach it from a religious perspective or a secular perspective. And that's the lens.
So he is saying that we need a unity, but surely he would agree that the unity seems to be amending itself or evolving itself all the time.
Escape of the problem, as far as I can tell, like all of those different consequences, let's say, of the death of God are problematic, to say the least. I'll close with one other observation, because it's in some ways what you're striving towards, as far as I can tell in this book. If there's a unity at the pinnacle, let's say, then what is its nature and also what should be its nature? So I would say, for example, that attempting to unify yourself or a society on the basis of power is a counterproductive enterprise. That's not a principle that's going to...
Oh, are they going to get into politics? Are they going to talk about political stuff as well? Power. Continual rise of the Pharisees, higher order unity. Yeah, probably. Camille Pyle, yeah. Nietzsche was wrong. Sexual reproduction, randomness. Seems like it could be decently philosophical.
produce.
I do wish. It's just so interesting how we need to have abstract conversations, but it's also so easy to make something sound appealing if it remains purely in the abstract realm. So, I mean, everyone knows this, but if you say, okay, we need some sort of unifying thing or we'll fragment, that sounds fairly good. And then you say, you know, you can pick and choose different anecdotes from history that satisfy that. Look at what happened here. You know, as tribes met and intermingled, they could only really find peace by praying to the same gods, so they integrated blah, 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 and got this pantheon with more of a hierarchy and the All-Father and blah. You know, Peterson would probably describe it something like that. Hopefully. I mean, nowadays he seems to be, I don't know, he seems to be more and more aware that his audience is wanting to hear solely Christian assertions. If you look at some of his older stuff, he was much more flexible in talking about Eastern religions and Taoism and Buddhism and Hinduism. Jesse said, proceeding to list the Eastern religions he knew.